So in these first three videos, let's take a look at creating this knit material. And throughout these three videos, we'll be taking a look at different sections, which are really going to be kind of different stages of the workflow that typically material artists take to create these kind of intricate patterns or materials or textiles or fabrics. But first things first, we have to go ahead and create a new project. So we can do that in two different ways. We can come up to File and create a new substance, or we can just click on this little Add New Substance button. And this is going to bring up the graph template. Now, for all intents and purposes, we're going to be working in this PBR metallic roughness template. And I'll go ahead and just rename this to be knit. And the rest of these options here, I'm just going to keep at default because realistically, we can change this all on the fly when we're working in our project, and it's not going to mess anything up anyways. So we can hit OK, and this is going to bring us into our graph. So it's going to load our graph view here, our 3D, our 2D, and then again, our library, explorer, and parameters if I go ahead and click on a node. Now, as the name suggests for this particular video, we're going to be taking a look at creating just the initial pattern, or really as it's more known, the initial height map. And the height map is really a good place to start for material or surface artists because it allows us to define obviously the surface information in a grayscale format, which is a lot easier to process and a lot easier to kind of understand on our end, the human end. But it also gives us enough information that we can draw from when we want to go ahead and create other surface information, such as our color or our normal map and roughness and so on and so forth, which we're going to be taking a look at for this material and the future ones as well. But in order to go ahead and start this one, let's go and create the base shape here. So I'm going to just hit spacebar and start to type in waveform. And you should have this waveform 1 node in your version of Substance Designer. And if we just bring that in, we can see it's going to give us this kind of like static frequency waveform shapes here. And if we scroll down, we'll see that we have a couple parameters that's going to come with this node. So the first thing I want to do is I want to decrease the number of the kind of large shapes we have here, only down to 1. So I can just take this wave number and bring that down to 1. And I also want to increase the number of samples because we can see it's kind of a little bit jittery right now. So if I bring this up, it's going to make it a little bit smoother, but we're still going to be getting some of this noise, right? These very streaky lines. And that's going to be a result of this noise slider right here, as we can see. So I'm going to bring that all the way down to 0. Really to just create that nice soft gradient, and it's going to be nice and smooth. And now while that looks really cool, it's still not quite there yet. I also want to go ahead and play around with this pattern slider. And as we can see, it's going to start giving us just kind of variations on this waveform pattern. And I found that a pattern of around 3 is actually pretty good for the look that we're going to be going for. However, now I'm kind of realizing that maybe it's still a little bit too tall and the edges are a little bit too thin. Now, fortunately, we do have control for this in the node itself, so we don't have to do any of that outside the node. So I can change this size min to be around 0.3, which is going to bulk up these sides here. And we can change the size max to be around 0.5. So now I've just kind of compressed it in a little bit to kind of give us this somewhat bulky thread shape. And believe it or not, this is actually really the only driving shape for the entirety of this material. So we don't have to create any more basic shapes, but instead, in this video and the next 2 videos, we're just going to be iterating on this specific pattern. So now that we've got this base shape, let's go and actually plug it into some of our outputs so that we can see it in our 3D view here. So I'll go ahead and plug this into our normal. I'm also going to go ahead and if we take a look, we do have an ambient occlusion and a height output as well. So because we're working only on the pattern or the height map so far, it's probably going to be best to plug it into only those 3 because that's really the only information we care about right now. So I'll go ahead and I'm just holding down Control and just clicking so that I can select that up there. And I'm still holding down Control and I'll click in there and I'll click in there. So we can go ahead and get rid of these two uniform color nodes because we don't need them anymore. And you'll notice that we're getting the shape showing up. However, it's now gone ahead and just made itself completely black in the areas that are black in our 2D view. And sometimes you might accidentally not have something going into your ambient occlusion, and you're just going to get a completely black 3D view. The reason that is, and it's not a bug, it's actually working as intended, is that you have nothing in your ambient occlusion output here, and so by default that's going to set it to black. And with an ambient occlusion map, pure black or a black value means that it's completely enshrouded in shadow or darkness. So what we're telling our render engine to do is basically say, hey, this entire cube is going to be considered in complete darkness. So what we can do instead, if I just Control Z that, is we can run this through an ambient occlusion node, which is going to take a grayscale input. So I'm going to just start to type in AO into my search, again hitting spacebar, and we're going to want to use this ambient occlusion HBAO node. And so if we take a look, right, it's going to accept a height, but realistically that's just an indication of maybe what you should be putting in. Really what is required is a grayscale image as denoted by the grayscale input socket. So again, holding Control, I'm just going to click this and plug that into there. And we can see this is a much more appropriate ambient occlusion map, which is being driven by this image here. So now if I plug this in, you can see that we're going to get some shadow information around kind of the shape itself, which is going to look a lot nicer. So now that we have the outputs relatively figured out for the time being, let's go ahead and iterate on this base shape. So right now it doesn't really look like it will in the final form, and that's because we have to do a little bit of extra work. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get rid of these very sharp contrasted edges, and instead I want to go ahead and add a little bit of a soft gradient to them. Now there's a couple nodes that could do this for you, but really the easiest one is going to be the blur node. So if I select this waveform and I hit space and I start to type in blur, we're going to have two options, and I'm going to opt to use the blur high quality grayscale just because it's, well, high quality. So that's going to add that onto our chain here, and we can see that it's done pretty much exactly what I wanted it to, where it's going to soften out those edges. And now in working with textures and creating height maps, you're not really ever going to want to have a height map that is just kind of pure black and white like this one is here. And instead, you're going to want to try and smooth out those contrasted values as much as you can, just because you're going to get some really harsh effects by using something as extreme as this for your height map. So that's why we're going to be blurring this. Now with the blur node, I'm going to bring the quality up to 1 just to make sure it's maintaining the highest quality blur that it can. And I'm also going to be bringing up our intensity to around, we'll say 16. So that's going to be a good first step, but I want to get rid of these edges where it's actually connecting with the edge of the texture sheet. And if I go ahead and hit spacebar in this 2D view, we can just see what the texture looks like repeating really for forever. And so what I want is I want to get rid of this connection to the outside walls of the texture itself, because that's going to allow me to really tile this a lot better when we want to create that tiled knit material. So what we can do is go ahead and add a shape node. So again, hitting space and typing in shape. And I'll just bring that in over top. And for this shape node, I'm going to go and use a paraboloid shape. And so the paraboloid is just going to be this nice soft sphere. And what we can do is use this shape to multiply or blend over top of this shape to eat away from only those edges that are kind of reaching those extents. So if I go and add a blend node here, and I bring this in the top socket, Let's go and change our blending mode to be multiply. And we can see just the difference here is that it's gone and eaten away from those edges, and we're no longer getting that solid connection. So that we're just getting really the essence of this threaded piece. However, I think it's a little bit too close to the edges still, so a way we can go ahead and fix that is by using this shape node again. We can go and just scale this down to around 0.9. And if we take a look in our 2D view, when I go ahead and commit this, you can see it's just shrunken that in a little bit. And now that our base pattern for most intents and purposes is in a really good spot, let's go ahead and start transforming this to create a new V-stitch pattern. And then from there, we'll be going ahead and tiling this onto itself to create that very intricate and very granular material. Now, that's definitely a lot of words that have been thrown at you, but let's take a look step by step to see what that actually means. So the first thing we want to do, like I've mentioned, is we want to transform this. And in terms of 2D and 3D, transform means we want to relocate or reposition, as well as potentially scaling or rotating. So on this blend node, I'm going to start to type in transformation, and we're going to have this transformation 2D node. It's also an atomic node, so we can see it's up here in our toolbar if you want to do it that way. And now nothing's really changed from the default image that we had, but you'll notice in our 2D view, we're going to have these handles, and my cursor is actually going to change depending on where I've placed it in our view. So with the transformation 2D, like I was saying, we can move this guy, we can rotate this guy, and we can scale this guy. And this is a very powerful node for us to use in Substance Designer because it gives us just that much more control. So what I want to do for this particular transformation 2D node is I just want to go ahead and start to rotate it or tilt it on the left here so that it's going to be somewhat angled, because what we're going to be doing is mirroring this so that we're going to get kind of a V pattern, or like an inverse V, I guess. So it doesn't really matter to what extent we go ahead and rotate this right now, because we can always come back later and tweak it. Now you might notice if I kind of rotate it here, we're going to get this pattern repeating. And so I want to make sure that we actually don't repeat this pattern for this particular shape, because we only want the shape in the middle, and anything else might actually screw up the information a little bit. So with our transformation 2D node, I want to come up to the base parameters for the node itself, not specific, like down here to transformation 2D. And under tiling mode, you can see that I can't go ahead and click this drop down. And the reason that is its inheritance method currently is relative to input. So whatever the tiling mode for this blend node is, this node is going to accept that and then use that or inherit it. We can also use relative to parent, which is whatever we decide to set for the graph itself. But because I know specifically for this node that I never want it to tile over the texture set, I can just set this to be absolute. So that now I can go ahead and change this to be absolutely no tiling. And that's gone ahead and gotten rid of that. So now I don't have to worry about accidentally introducing new tiling information. And now the next transformation I want to do is I want to take this shape and just move it to the left a little bit. Now we could do this with this node here, right? I can just go ahead and start to bring this over. But I find that sometimes it gets a little bit weird when you've rotated things, then you've also moved them, and perhaps you've even maybe scaled them too. So I find it's a little bit easier to kind of break it up into different nodes so that the transformation really isn't getting too screwy on you. So off of this transformation 2D node, let's go ahead and add another transformation 2D node. And so this one is going to be specific to just movement or translation. So now what I can do is click and holding Shift, I'm just going to bring it onto the left, and we can even be a little bit more specific with this offset here and say maybe 0.25. And actually that's maybe a little bit too far. Let's bring that in just a little bit more, but we can do something like that. So that now if I do want to go ahead and rotate this a little bit more, I can just use this first node here without having to worry about messing up the translation. So now once we've got this pushed over, what I can do is go ahead and start to mirror this. So we can use a mirror grayscale node. And when I plug that in, we can see that it's just taken whatever we have on the left side here and mirrored that over. So now we're going to be able to very nicely tweak our shapes here. Again, maybe rotating a little bit, maybe bringing stuff out, and it's all going to update accordingly in our final mirror grayscale node. Now, once we've gotten to the point where we're satisfied with this basic pattern, we're going to be able to use a tiling node to tile it onto itself and create a more intricate pattern with a lot of repetitions or iterations of this thing we've created. So what I can do is hit spacebar again and start to type in tile. And we're going to have this tile generator, tile random, and tile sampler. And so we're going to be using tile sampler because it's a little bit more flexible and a little bit more powerful than the other two. And it's going to be this nice big colossal node. So let's go and just plug in our pattern here into the top socket, which is our pattern input. And I'm going to just hold down Shift and click to steal this connection here and plug it into there. So now we're just rerouting this connection. And we can see, nice and easy, we're going to be going and tiling our pattern. Okay, maybe not tiling our pattern, but tiling a pattern. So that's a start. So to use our pattern in this node, we'll have to come under pattern and go and select pattern input. But it's not going to be tiling it exactly like how we want it because life is not always perfect like that. So the first thing I do want to do is come up to the X and the Y amount here. And let's change both of these to be 45 so that we're going to get a couple iterations of tiling for this piece. I'm also going to come down under pattern again, and the pattern input filtering, I'm going to set to just bilinear because that's going to give us the nicest filtering method for our base patterns. Now the tile sampler node has a ton of parameters in it, most of which we're not really going to be touching, but I do want to come down to the size header here because we're going to have to kind of reconfigure the shape on the X and Y for these pieces to really connect them and actually make it look like they're interwoven. And so more specifically, I want to go ahead and stretch these a little bit vertically on the Y. So we'll see that this slider only goes from 0 to 1. But most sliders in a lot of nodes in Substance Designer are actually just soft caps, meaning if I double click on it and I type 2 and hit enter, it's actually going to allow me to input that, and it's now remapped this slider here. Now I don't want to actually use 2, but maybe more a value like 1.6 so that it's going to be a little bit more stretched vertically. But now I can go ahead and with our scale, just do around 1.2. So that now these pieces are going to look like they're intersecting or interweaving with each other to create this really, really cool pattern. And again, if I take a look, right, hitting spacebar in my 2D view, we can see that it's going to tile seamlessly across all of the directions, which is really sweet. However, in our 3D view, it's not looking too hot, right? And there's two reasons for that. The first reason is our ambient occlusion is just way too strong, right? We can see that it's basically just pure shadow, which really wouldn't be the case for this kind of fabric. So with our ambient occlusion node, let's bring the height depth down to around 0.02. So that we're going to really shallow that up, and that's already starting to look better. And we can also take a look at our normal here, right? And it might be okay for the intensity, but we can also just bump this up slightly to around 2 to maybe help kind of solidify those shapes there. And again, it's going to be something you can just play around with. And finally, for our tile sampler node, before we continue on, what I want to do is add some very subtle variety to the actual values of each one of these patterns. And so what we can do, if we scroll all the way down to the very bottom, under this color heading, we can go and play with the color random slider. And if we take a look, as I bring this up, it's just going to randomly apply a certain grayscale value to each one of these. But very easily, it's going to be kind of too intense, and that's just way too much. So let's do around 0.2, which is going to be a very, very subtle change in the grayscale values between these, but it's just going to help break up and add some variety to this overall pattern so that they're not all at the same height and they're going to have some kind of fold or deviation to them. The next vital step in this particular material that I want to try and tackle is going to be some random kind of like threads and stray fabric that you'd maybe get in between some of the areas in here and maybe across some of the surfaces as well. And so to start that piece out, I'm going to come up here and I'm going to start to search for directional scratches. And this node is going to pretty much do exactly as the name suggests, really like they all do, and just give us some of these horizontally facing scratch lines here. Now we're going to have a lot of different parameters again we can play with, particularly the scale, which we're going to want to really bring up, which inversely is going to scale it down, but you know. And that's going to be because we have such small information for these shapes. So we want to try and match that up kind of size-wise. Now we'll also notice on our pattern, right, it's going in kind of different directions as we've seen with that V pattern, but these scratches are going from left to right. And so I want to try and randomize these up a little bit as well by using this angle random slider here. And we'll do maybe around 0.4. Again, you can do whatever you want. And now I want to add some also just kind of random warpiness to this as well, so that these aren't all just going to be straight lines, but instead are going to kind of warp a little bit. So with our directional scratches, I'm going to add a directional warp node. And this is going to allow us to plug in an intensity input, which is just a random grayscale image, and give these some kind of warping directions. So I'll drag and drop that socket out. And let's start to search for a Gaussian noise. And this is just kind of a random procedurally created noise, which is going to be perfect for this particular kind of operation. So if I zoom in here, we can see it's now starting to warp kind of around those gradiated values. And with this directional warp node, what I can do is actually play around with the intensity of it. So maybe we'll do something around 6. And I can play around with the direction that it's going to use this intensity input, which is really cool. So we can do something kind of random like that. And this is going to be our random kind of stray threads. So how are we going to blend this together with our pattern here? Well, it's going to start by first using a blend node. So let's go and start to type in blend. And let's just plug this in over top. And so we can see we're going to get all of that really scratchy noise, but we're not going to get anything underneath. So we're going to have to play around with the opacity, the blending mode, and we're actually going to be creating a mask as well. As you've noticed, we have an opacity or mask input on the bottom of these blend nodes. So taking a look at our tile sampler again, we're going to have to think about where we actually want to place this kind of scratchy noise. And like I had mentioned, I kind of want it to fill some of these darker areas and then maybe kind of come upwards a little bit and just kind of around some of the edges of the surfaces for this pattern. So I'll just drag another socket out and release that. And let's start to type in histogram select. And you can see we have a whole wide range of histogram nodes, but the one I want to use is going to be select. And this is going to allow me to select a specific region of this height map. And this is really good for creating these kind of masks. So position 0 is going to be the darkest areas, as we can see, of our grayscale node. And I can increase the range that this kind of sifts through and starts to find. So in this particular mask, we're denoting white areas as areas that we want the top input to be shown up in our blend. And black areas are going to be areas where we're going to just purely show this bottom or middle input. So we can see once I plug this mask into our blend, what it's going to kind of do is get rid of some of the scratches kind of in the areas where they're more over top of our pattern, and then really promote them and emphasize them in the darker areas. Now, this is also a good spot to really show you the flexibility and the raw power of Substance Designer, is that this is looking kind of bad, right? With the resolution that we have being a 2K image. So I can just come up to here, and if you don't have this option, what you can do is just come over and select this parent toolbar option here and enable that. And I can just go and bump this up very easily to a 4K image, and it's going to take a second to process. But now we're actually operating in a 4K image space, and you can see the resolution has greatly expanded. And it's completely non-destructive to our texture and our material as we've created it so far. So now, as we're working with more minute detail, it might be a little bit more prevalent to go ahead and start working at a higher resolution. So now we can see that we're going to get these kind of stray fabrics or threads running around and kind of running amok on our material here. I also want to go ahead, like I had mentioned, and change the opacity to maybe be around 0.1 so that it's really just kind of slight. I'm also going to go and change the blending mode from copy to be max lighten, so that we're only going to get those kind of scratchy areas for these kind of stray fabrics there, and we're not going to be getting anything else. So now as I pull out, it's not super noticeable because again, this is a very small detail, but potentially if you're zooming in for a little bit higher res shots or closer up, you're going to want to definitely have this kind of information there. And now the final information I want to introduce to our basic pattern here is I want to go ahead and kind of add a little bit of variety to the overall shape in general. Because right now it's pretty uniform and it's very straight and grid-like. Maybe this is such a small detail you'll never really notice it, but I like to include it in my particular fabrics to again just try and further break it all up. And so what I mean by that is, like we used the directional warp for these scratches here, I now want to do that for our pattern here, but maybe to a little bit lesser of an extent. So let's go and use a directional warp node again. And this time I'm going to use another Gaussian noise. Now we can plug this in to our directional warp. And by default, it's going to be really intense. And it's going to look kind of cool, but certainly not the result we're going to want. So let's bring this back to around 0.75. So we can see it's not exactly straight and it's adding a little bit of waviness to the overall aspect of our tileable here. And I can also change the direction that these are going to kind of sway over to. And now with not too many nodes, we've gone ahead and created a pretty good looking tileable knit material, which we can use really anywhere we want. However, I've saved this part to the end of the video because it's going to highlight a couple different things. One, it's going to highlight that we can further go into creating more detail for these patterns. And two, it's going to show you that you don't need to create everything in a chronological order, and instead you can work to a certain point, realize you maybe need to go back and tweak a couple things, and this is where the power of Substance Designer really comes into play as well. Is just the sheer flexibility that it offers in such a non-destructive workflow. So we'll notice that for the initial pattern, right, I've gone ahead and just created a very soft looking shape here, and we've not really done too much to it until we kind of tiled it and then added a little bit of those kind of scuffy stray threads. But maybe I want to go ahead and actually create some threads that are going to adhere to this initial shape itself, to again just add further detail so that these aren't just, very smooth kind of blobs. And I can definitely assure you that adding that kind of detail, once you've gotten to a point like this, where there's just so much going on in your texture, it's going to be way too hard to add those kind of striations into these larger thread shapes. So where we're going to add that is actually going to be back towards the start of our chain here, and we're going to be able to do that very easily. So the first one I want to add is going to be before we go ahead and use this shape node and after we've created this blend. So let's go ahead and add another directional scratches node as we've seen before. And this time what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that the scale is down to 1. So it's going to be a lot larger, right? Because we're working on a little bit larger information for the time being. I'm also going to bring our angle random up to around 0.05. So it's going to be very, very small in comparison to what we've seen before. So let's bring this down to 0.4 so that we're only going to get, kind of half or 40% of the patterns. And I also want to make these a little bit fatter on the X here. So let's bring that up to around 3. And we're going to leave the Y at 20. So we're going to get something kind of like this. And again, it's going to be a procedural tiling texture. And let's go and add a blend node so that we're going to be adding this particular surface information over top of our initial base shape from the beginning. So I'll plug this in. And let's change the blending mode to be multiply so that we're going to be able to get some of these darker kind of creases so that it's going to kind of look like some threads. So we'll do multiply there. And let's bring the opacity down to around 20%. So that we can see it's very, very subtle on this piece here, but that's drastically changed the look of each one of these threads, because as we can take a look in our chain here, right? We've created that here. It's gone ahead and still done the multiplication or the multiply. We've rotated it. We've gone ahead and moved it over and mirrored it. And that's all still going to be working in our dynamic system. And so if we add nodes further up in our chain or closer to the beginning, it's still going to process all that information as if nothing actually ever changed. And that's really a lot of the power that comes from this particular application. So in the previous video, we took a look at defining the knit pattern, also known as the height map. And this particular map is going to be what drives most of our output textures, which are going to be the textures we'll bring into other applications, such as game engines or render engines, depending on what the context is that you're creating these materials for. So the first output texture that I want to take a look at is going to be our base color. Now you may have heard this be called other things, such as diffuse or albedo. For all intents and purposes, we're going to be referring to this as base color, just because sometimes, depending on applications, diffuse and albedo might mean different things. And now we can see by default, because we've clicked on the PBR metallic roughness template, it's going to plug just a generic uniform color node into our base color. And that's why everything was gray when we were looking at it in the previous episode. So if I go and just start, changing this to be different colors, we can see that really I can make this knit material whatever I want it to be. So we can get something kind of cool like this turquoise aqua looking color, or we could make it just kind of orange. Now we're not going to be getting too much into the weeds with the color channel, the base color channel for this particular material. One, to keep things simple as we're just starting off with this first material. As well, this material actually doesn't look too great with a lot of color variation. If you go ahead and take a look at any t-shirt that you have lying around, you'll notice that there really is not a lot of color variation in the threads themselves. We're going to go ahead and keep this as one solid color for now, but we'll look at more intricate color setups in future materials. So taking a look at this uniform color, we'll see that I have this eyedropper button here, which I can go ahead and just start to pick any of the colors that I have on my screen. So off my screen here, I've actually got a nice kind of whitish color that I'm going to pick. And you can go ahead and pause the video and just color pick this little color here. And this is actually going to be the base color for our default knit material. Now, as we continue to go down our list of outputs here, we've already taken a look at our normals, and I'm pretty satisfied with the intensity of 2. Because again, anything higher is really just going to boost these out too much, and we don't really want them to be super intense. However, the next option we're going to have is this roughness. And right now we're just getting a base output of whatever this gray color is, and by default yours might be a little bit darker. Now in a lot of instances, knowing how and where to start a roughness map is oftentimes a little bit challenging because there's really no best way and there's really no bad way either, really. But I'll show you a way that I like to start because it makes a lot of sense in terms of what information we're drawing and where we're drawing it from. So if we think about it, roughness or surface roughness is going to be kind of dependent on the surface itself, right? Areas that are a little bit more exposed might be a little bit rougher. Areas that are a little bit hidden could potentially be glossy, or they could be rough depending on if there's dirt collection. And so there's a whole wide range of things to think about and consider when developing roughness. Now for this particular material, not as critical, but I'll show you what we're going to be thinking of. So in our normal map, we'll notice that it's going to display, well, surface information, right? That's kind of the whole shtick of working with a normal map. So what I'll be able to do is actually use this normal map to also kind of drive our roughness output. And so what I'll do is go ahead and delete this, and I'll go ahead and plug this in. But it's not going to make a lot of sense initially because a roughness map is grayscale. However, a normal map is color. So what we can do is by selecting only this connection here, right? I don't want to select the node because it's going to plug it into both of these. I just want it to be on the roughness connection. I'm going to start to type in curvature. And curvature is going to give us 3 different results. And they're all just kind of different methods of calculating curvature, which really is just finding edges and surface values. But the one that works the best I've found is going to be curvature smooth, because we don't want really any super harsh or very contrasted information. And instead we'll just get a nice kind of softer image there. So now the world is happy because we've got a grayscale image going into the roughness output. But now we need to consider what a roughness map value actually does. So in roughness, a black or darker value is actually going to be very glossy or very shiny. And we might be able to kind of see that a little bit on our material here, right? Kind of right down in those center pieces there. It's going to be almost like it's wet or kind of like really slick. And white values are going to be areas, inversely, which are rougher. So it does make kind of a bit of sense to have these areas as being, brighter because they're going to be rougher because it's all fabric and thread. But I don't want areas that are going to be really as dark as maybe the areas in there. So I'm going to have to try and figure out a way that I can go ahead and kind of play around with the grayscale values in this histogram. And if you recall from last video, right, you might be thinking, oh, histogram. I know that he showed me a couple different histogram nodes. And you could, but I kind of did that to be a bit of a red herring. Instead, what we're going to be using is another atomic node, which is incredibly useful, and it is called the levels node. And again, we can see it here or right up here. So when I plug this in, if you've ever used Photoshop or something before, it is exactly the same workflow as using a levels in a 2D image editor of that capacity. So you probably are going to be very familiar with this kind of setup, or at least understand it a little bit more intuitively than some of the other nodes that we have access to. And so again, what we can do is play around with these handles to increase our dark values. But remember, right? Dark values makes things a little bit glossier, so we don't really want to go that way. And we can also bring in our white values to make everything a little bit brighter. We're also able to actually bring in our black outputs so that we are kind of clamping the darkest value that we can output here. And inversely, we can do that for our bright values so that our brightest pixel is maybe something like a mid-gray, as we can see in this histogram here. So this is really going to allow you to play around with your values and find something that works best for your material. But what I think I'm going to do for this particular instance is just keep this kind of close to this histogram start here. And I'm just going to make sure that we're not getting any kind of pure black values. And maybe our darkest value is going to be somewhat of a mid-gray. And I think that's going to look okay. Now, as we continue down again, we'll notice that we have this metallic output, and I've really not done anything with it. And for this tutorial series, we really aren't going to be doing anything with the metallic output, simply because we're not creating any fabrics that have metal included in them. But the idea of a metallic map is to denote areas of your material, which should be considered by the function, which is basically calculating how to read all of these maps in a 3D view, as an area that should adhere to metallic or metal properties of light and color and specular diffusion. So we're not going to get too much into that, but just know that for all of these materials we'll be creating, we're going to want to leave this as a pure black value. So that's going to be good to go. And finally, we'll just check up on our ambient occlusion and our height again, remembering that we don't want this to be super intense, and I actually might bring this down a little bit more to maybe 0.01, because we don't really want it super dark. And this is going to look a lot better once we bring this into a render engine. And finally, for our height, again, I think the values that we have here are going to be good to go. So that's going to be it for our output textures. And these are going to be what we're going to use in other applications when we want to go ahead and use a knit material. In the next and final video for this particular material, we'll look at how we can expose parameters to add some flexibility to these, so that if we were to give this to a teammate or somebody else that wants to go ahead and use this, or even for ourselves in a render or game engine, we don't have to come back in and change these particular aspects of the material, but instead we can open up the material to accepting new user input to develop new designs on the fly. So once we've gotten to the point where we're satisfied with our height map, and we're also pretty happy with the final output textures of our material, it's going to be time to go and start thinking about how we can expose parameters which could be used in other applications. And now I've said expose parameters a couple times in the previous videos, but what does that mean? Well, if we take a look at each one of these nodes, right, we'll know that they have specific parameters that are going to be unique to those nodes. And we're not going to be able to access those outside of Substance Designer itself. So anytime I want to make a change, I have to come back into Substance Designer, open up my graph, and go and tweak those values. And that can be a bit of a pain, especially when you're working in projects that have a ton of different materials that you constantly need to make minor tweaks on. So what we can do is actually expose these various parameters to be used in other applications that have these substance integrations built into them. So let's take a look at exposing the color value for this particular material, so that when I get into Arnold Renderer or Maya or Blender, and I want to just change the color outright, I don't have to come back into SD and do that all here. So let's click on our uniform color, and I'll come over to where we have this little drop-down button. And we can see that it's manage the function which controls this parameter. So that might be a little bit intimidating, and certainly these constant value empty function buttons don't help that intimidation factor. But what we want to do is go ahead and expose this. So I'll click expose, and we can give this parameter a name. Now by default, it's going to call it output color. However, we could give it a new name, but because we're only exporting or exposing this one value, it's going to be fine to leave it as it is. So I'll hit OK, and we'll notice that, oh my God, what happened to my output color, right? I'm not going to be able to access this here in this node because this parameter no longer belongs to this node alone. So what I have to do is actually double click anywhere in my graph where you can see the grid lines, because that parameter now belongs to the graph itself. So we can see under input parameters and parameters, we have output color. So I can drop this down, and now this parameter lives globally within our graph, which is now going to allow us to access this in other applications. And we'll be looking at what that means a little bit later in the series once we get to rendering. And so we can see that this maybe looks a little bit intimidating because we've got a lot of empty text boxes, we've got float 4 and identifiers, and it all is maybe a little bit new to us, but I assure you it's not as scary as it seems at first glance. The identifier, again, is just the parameter name that is used to identify this very specific color value. Because you can expose multiple color value options, but for the system to actually know which one specifically you're talking about, you need to give it a unique identifier. The next options we have are the type and the editor, which are all done for you by default, by the way. And we can see that we have a float4 type with an editor type of color RGBA. Now we don't need to actually touch any of that because it's all been set up by default, but this type and this editor is going to be the reason why we're actually accessing a color GUI down here. So the next option that I'll take a look at is going to be label, and this is going to be the human readable title for what this parameter does. Like we have seen in other parameters where we have a slider that gives us the intensity, or we have a true false button, the label is actually what the human will read to know what this parameter does. And so I'm going to call this knit base color, so that once we go ahead and export all of this into another application, I'll know that this is a color value for the knit material. And now if we wanted to go ahead and change the default color that we've set this value to, we can actually go and do that here. So now if I go and change this to be that kind of orange color, we see that updates our graph here. And when we go and export this material to be used elsewhere, when it comes into the application, by default, it's going to be this orange color. Now I'm just going to go and Control Z that to bring it back to our nice white value. But really, in a nutshell, this has been exposing parameters. Now, if we wanted to go ahead and preview this to see what it would look like in other applications as well, we can just come up to preview here and check that on. And we can see that it will have a knit base color label on it. And we can go ahead and start changing the material.